Land never lost, only uncounted. People never landless, only mapless. It forces us to look at the census not as a neutral gathering of data, but as a political document that curates reality. When you see 3/5 of all other persons, or excluding Indians not taxed, you are seeing the architecture of a theft that is still playing out in probate courts today.
We are taught that the history of Black America is linear. The Middle Passage, the plantation, emancipation, and then the Great Migration to northern cities. But what if that narrative is geometrically impossible? We are talking about a discrepancy between 46,000 plantations and 6 million displaced people. Where were they really living?
The math has never added up. You have a situation where textbooks claim a relatively small number of plantation sites account for the entirety of the Black population's location prior to the Great Migration. But when you consult the Geographic Names Information System, the GNIS, which is the federal standard for geographic nomenclature, you find something startling. There are over 1,100,000 unincorporated, uncounted communities listed. These are places that have names, histories, and local recognition, but they do not possess a municipal charter. They don't have a mayor, they don't have a city hall, and because they lack that corporate status, they effectively vanish from the standard census narrative. The argument here, and it aligns with the work of historians like Ivan Van Sertima, is that Black people were not solely confined to the plantation block. They were populating over 1 million distinct settlements, some with names that predate the existence of the United States itself.
You mentioned Van Sertima, who famously argued, and they came before Columbus, that there was an African presence in the Americas predating European colonization. That is a controversial stance in mainstream academia, which usually frames Black presence solely through the lens of the transatlantic slave trade. Are you suggesting that these unincorporated communities, these dots on the GNIS map, are physical evidence of that pre-colonial presence?
I am suggesting we look at the toponymy, the study of place names. We aren't just finding names like Smithville or Jonesboro. We are finding Timbuktu in Alabama. We find Egypt in Mississippi, which was a thriving community with a church and cemetery recorded as late as 1960. We see Morocco in North Carolina, listed as a populated place since 1891. Liberia in South Carolina. These aren't just random designations. The persistence of these names suggests a lineage that refused to be erased, even if the Census Bureau refused to count them. Van Sertima's argument gains weight when you look at the sheer volume of these communities. If you have 6 million people and only 46,000 plantations, the surplus population had to reside somewhere. They were likely in these hollows, swamps, and unincorporated lands, communities that were self-sustaining and crucially distinct from the slave economy, until they were forced into it or displaced from it.
This brings us to the mechanism of erasure. If these communities existed, if people were living in Timbuktu, Alabama, or Morocco, North Carolina, how does the federal government not see them? It seems impossible to hide millions of people. But you're pointing to the Constitution itself, specifically the language regarding who gets counted.
It is not a clerical error. It is a constitutional feature. Look at Article 1, Section 2. The 3/5 clause is infamous, but people forget the specific exclusionary language, excluding Indians not taxed. This phrase is the bureaucratic weapon of mass erasure. For a significant portion of American history, if you were an Indigenous person living in an unincorporated area, meaning you weren't part of the taxable, chartered civilization, you were not counted. You did not exist on the federal roll. Now, consider the intersection of Black and Indigenous identity. Many of these unincorporated communities were populated by free people of color, Black Indigenous groups, or mixed communities who remained on their ancestral land. They were categorized as Indians not taxed. They were legally invisible.
So the transition, the moment they appear in history, is actually a moment of reclassification. It's not that they suddenly arrived, it's that the label changed. When did that shift happen?
It happens aggressively between 1860 and 1900, as the census marshals moved into these rural, unincorporated areas, often to enforce tax collection or facilitate land seizures. They stopped writing Indian not taxed. They started writing Negro. With a stroke of a quill, the marshal strips the Indigenous claim to the land. If you are Indian, you have a treaty right or a territorial claim. If you are Negro in the eyes of the 19th century court, you are presumed to be the descendant of an enslaved person, likely a migrant, and therefore you have no ancestral claim to the soil you are standing on. This reclassification was a method of dispossessing people of heir property. It credited their existence to the transatlantic trade, while erasing the Indigenous bloodline that connected them to that specific geography.
That reclassification serves a clear economic purpose. If you sever the Indigenous tie, you open the door for land theft. This leads us to the staggering statistics regarding land ownership. We often hear about the 40 acres and a mule promise that was broken, but there was a period where black land ownership spiked, followed by a precipitous decline. The numbers are difficult to wrap your head around.
The numbers are catastrophic. Between 1865 and 1919, African Americans managed to acquire approximately 15 million acres of land. They did this largely without access to banks, lawyers, or federal aid. This was sheer grit, often purchased collectively or held as family commons. That number has plummeted to roughly 1 million acres. That is a 97% loss. We need to contextualize the value of that loss. We are talking about generational wealth transfer. An analysis of this lost acreage places the value at roughly $326 billion. To put that in perspective, that is more wealth than the market caps of Walmart, Target, and Home Depot combined. That wealth vanished from the black community and reappeared in the portfolios of corporate agriculture, developers, and the timber industry.
The mechanism for that loss is often heir property, correct? This legal limbo where land is passed down without a will, leading to fractionated ownership. But based on what you're saying about the unincorporated towns, the vulnerability starts even before the legal battles. It starts with the lack of incorporation. If your town isn't a town, you don't have the zoning protections, the police force, or the political leverage to stop a highway from coming through.
Precisely. Incorporation is a shield. When you look at the famous black towns that did incorporate, places like Mound Bayou, Mississippi, or Eatonville, Florida, where Zora Neale Hurston grew up, they had a fighting chance because they were legal entities. They had a mayor who could sue, they had borders, but for the 1 million unincorporated spots, the dots we spoke of, they were completely exposed. When the Great Migration happened, it wasn't just people looking for factory jobs in Chicago. It was often a forced exodus from these unprotected lands. People didn't just leave their ancestral homes in the South because they wanted to see the North. They were pushed. Their communities were zoned out of existence, flooded by dam projects, or simply burned out. The narrative that millions of people just wandered off the plantation is fiction. They walked out of communities that were being systematically dismantled.
I want to circle back to the cultural legacy of these places. You mentioned Eatonville and Mound Bayou, but also Stamps, Arkansas, associated with Maya Angelou, and Jackson Ward. These weren't just residential areas, they were incubators for intellectual giants. It seems like the isolation of these Black Wall Streets, whether incorporated or not, created a pressure cooker for talent.
Isolation necessitated self-sufficiency, which in turn bred excellence. In Jackson Ward, you had Maggie Walker becoming the first woman to charter a bank in the United States. In Holly Springs, you had the foundations that produced Ida B. Wells. These communities had to build their own economies, their own schools, and their own mythologies. But the tragedy is how many of these incubators are now lost to the map. We know Eatonville because Zora wrote it down, but what about the thousands of other communities that didn't have a Zora? They are the dots in the GNIS database that no longer have a population count. They are the Indians not taxed who were reclassified and then displaced. The cultural loss is incalculable because we don't even know the names of the geniuses we lost when those communities were scattered.
Let's shift to the practical. You have described a history of erasure, census manipulation, reclassification, and land theft. But for a family listening to this, perhaps a family organizing a reunion or looking at an old deed, what is the recourse? You can't rewrite the 1870 census, but you are suggesting there are ways to pierce the veil of this bureaucratic silence.
You cannot rewrite the past, but you can correct the record for the future. The first step is to stop accepting the standard census roll as the totality of your family history. You need to order the 1790 and 1870 census records, but you have to look outside the standard columns. Specifically, look outside the slave schedules. If your ancestors were in one of these unincorporated areas, they might not be listed where you expect. You need to pull the GNIS codes and census-designated place, CDP codes, for the county your family is from. Ask the county clerk specifically, when was this place incorporated? If it wasn't, or if it was incorporated late, dig into the land deeds prior to that date. You are looking for the transition from Indian not taxed or free person of color to Negro. That transition point is often where the title issues begin.
And regarding the land itself, if a family still holds a piece of this heir property, that fractionated ownership we discussed is a ticking time bomb.
The solution is aggressive organization. You cannot leave land in the name of a great-grandfather who died in 1920. Families must convene, get the cousins, the aunts, the estranged siblings, and form a family LLC or a trust. You have to record an operating agreement. You need to move the land from a vulnerable heirship status into a protected corporate entity. This isn't just about money, it's about sovereignty, holding the ground that remains. And equally important, advocate for preservation status. These unincorporated hamlets deserve the same historic protection as a Civil War battlefield or a Victorian district. If your family land has a name like Liberia or Egypt, that is historic evidence. Use it. Petition the state for a historical marker. Make the invisible visible.
It reframes the family reunion entirely. It's not just a barbecue. It's a shareholder meeting for a legacy that has survived 500 years of attempted erasure. It is an act of resistance to gather on land that the map tried to swallow.
Exactly. The narrative has been that we were landless people seeking a home. The reality is that we were a landed people who were made mapless. The land was never lost. It is right there, under our feet, in the county clerk's basement, in the GNIS database. It was just uncounted. The marshals changed the labels, but they couldn't change the soil. The challenge now is to refuse the rename, to refuse the narrative that says you are a runaway. You are a descendant of the settlers who built the towns that America tries to pretend never existed. Hold the ground.
We have to sit with that distinction. Land never lost, only uncounted. People never landless, only mapless. It forces us to look at the census not as a neutral gathering of data, but as a political document that curates reality. When you see 3/5 of all other persons, or excluding Indians not taxed, you are seeing the architecture of a theft that is still playing out in probate courts today.
And that theft continues as long as we remain passive about the documentation. The $326 billion loss didn't happen overnight. It happened deed by deed, tax sale by tax sale. Reversing it requires the same granular attention to detail. It requires checking the tax deeds after 1910, where a massive amount of dispossession occurred. It requires understanding that the Great Migration was for many a crime scene they were fleeing. If we treat the land as a crime scene, we investigate it differently. We don't just accept that grandma sold it. We ask who bought it, for how much, and was the sale forced because the county refused to recognize the town's existence? Fiction needs erasure to work. The truth just needs the light of day. And that light is found in the archives, in the GNIS codes, and in the refusal to let those names, Timbuktu, Morocco, Egypt, fade into the background of a generic American map.
It brings a new gravity to the concept of indigenous, whether one subscribes fully to Van Sertima's pre-Columbian contact theory or views it through the lens of post-colonial settlement. The functional reality is the same. Black communities were native to these specific soils for centuries before they were told they didn't belong. They built the infrastructure, named the geography, and buried their dead there.
We must recognize that indigenous in the American legal context was often a tax bracket before it was a racial category. By manipulating that tax bracket, the state manipulated identity. If you accept that you are merely a transient, a guest on American soil, you act differently than if you know you are the host. The people living in those 1 million uncounted communities were hosts. They were the foundational layer of the rural South and Midwest. Recovering that mindset is just as important as recovering the deed. You stop asking for permission to be there. You start asserting your right to the preservation of your history.
This conversation dismantles the simplicity of the 40-acre story. It suggests that for many, the 40 acres wasn't a gift to be given, but a recognition of what was already held and subsequently stolen. The tragedy isn't just the broken promise, it's the active confiscation of the self-determined success that followed.
We mourn the lack of reparations while ignoring the ongoing liquidation of the assets we did secure. That 97% loss is the statistic that should keep us up at night. But the flip side is that 3% still remains, and those 1 million uncounted dots on the map are sleeping giants. If we can reconnect the history to geography, if we can trace the titles and protect the remaining heir property, we aren't just saving land. We are correcting the census. We are writing the people back into the Constitution.